Well, Professor Lucia Anelich, who's a food safety expert from Anelich Consulting, joins us now to further unpack on this topic as well as contribute to our food safety, of course, focus. Prof, great having you with us today. Thank you so much for your time. So tensions are quite high in the country with the recent spate of these suspected contaminated food products that have now led to some multiple fatalities and even ill health of some community members, especially children. But I suppose it has also highlighted the serious need that our food safety policies as well as standards actually need to be adhered to as well as enforced. And this will, of course, require serious collaborated efforts. But where do we start?
That's a very loaded question. Good afternoon, first of all, to you and the viewers. It's a very tough question to answer as to where do we start. I think, food legislation followed by food regulations is absolutely critical in any country when it comes to food safety and also food quality. We mustn't forget the quality side of food as well. And in South Africa, we've got actually good legislation in place for the most part. Of course, there are gaps, but where it actually starts is a food safety policy, because that is where the intention of government and what government intends to put forward in terms of resources and structures to make sure that food is safe for human consumption. And that's where the policy is then incorporated into all of those aspects, elaborating on all of those aspects. Mm-hmm. And crucially, Africa does not have a food safety policy.
Yes, Professor. I mean, we have been covering these incidents when they were still very sporadic, right? And maybe let's just backtrack a bit for the benefit of our viewers, since this news have been in the public domain for quite some time now. Let's first understand, Professor, the difference between one, a sell-by date, two, an expiry date, as well as a use-by date.
Yeah, that's a critical question, and I'm glad you asked it. The use-by date and the best before date are the two dates that are actually the most important for a consumer. The sell-by date is the date that the retailer places on a product that the retailer feels it should be sold by that date. But the use-by date is generally accepted as the one related to food safety, whereas the best before date is more about food quality. So I always use chocolate with hazelnuts, for example, as an example of a best before date that might be exceeded, but that doesn't mean that the chocolate becomes all of a sudden unsafe for human consumption. It means that it's not at its peak quality any longer. So the nut might be slightly rancid, which is not always pleasurable to taste, but it's certainly not going to hurt or harm the person who eats it. The use-by date, however, is most often used, and if you look around, you probably see them most often on perishable foods, because those are the ones that you need to use quickly before they become a potential food safety risk. And the reason for this is important, because food is not sterile. Food is made in an environment where there are bacteria, and not all bacteria are harmful. So we must understand that we are surrounded by these organisms. They are all over our bodies, on top of our bodies, on our skin, in our ears, in our mouths, in our noses, on our hair, and then inside our bodies, and they actually play a pretty vital role in keeping us healthy. So food cannot always be sterile. In the most part, it isn't. And this is an important point to make.
Absolutely, Prof. And we know, because of the high cost of food in the country, there's even shops that actually do sell some of these products that are not necessarily expired, but a lot of people are rushing there. Even some of these informal traders are actually stocking up at these shops. But now, obviously, the kids in this instance have been some of the victims. They cannot know these specific checks and balances, Professor. And even if they did, they cannot determine the authenticity of such label. Are there any telltale signs or easy to spot things that anyone who can actually read to understand can look out for before consuming any product, especially that they acquired from informal traders?
Well, if a food looks spoiled, for example, if there is a fungus growing on it, or it's a juice that is starting to bubble, it means there's a fermentation, there's a yeast in the juice that is now spoiling the product. And a fungal growth you can see on bread, you can see it on cheese, sometimes you see this green-blue growth on an orange. Those are spoilage issues, and one would typically avoid them. But food safety, unfortunately, you cannot see, taste, smell, and so it becomes really, really difficult to know when a product is unsafe for human consumption. What we must distinguish here, though, is in this particular situation with these children dying and becoming ill very, very, very tragically in these instances, this is more a question of a substance like a chemical, which is what we believe is the case here, that has entered the food somehow, and we don't know how yet. There is speculation as to the repacking and unpacking of bulk snacks, repacking the snacks in an environment where these chemicals are being stored or used illegally, I must add. So this is not a normal situation, if I can use the word normal here, because this is quite rare and it is something that should never have happened in the first place. And it is more a question of adulteration of food. And so this is a slightly different perspective as to sort of normal food safety related issues that we talk about when we talk about use by dates. Specifically, use by date specifically.
Mm-hmm. So, Prof, basically we have a serious problem then where government actually needs to implement reform as well as enforce all these policies as well as bylaws, and also for the consumers themselves to further educate themselves on food safety and ask the relevant questions when buying consumables. And spaza owners and dealers themselves also need to be educated, and to also increase the number of inspectors by government who will not be corrupt and take bribes. So concerted efforts are pretty much needed across board. There's been quite a lot of criticism about government's slow response to this current crisis. What is your response to this?
Absolutely. Everything you've said is quite correct. There has to be proper inspection. There needs to be compliance to our basic food hygiene law, which is R638. It's the so-called certificate of acceptability, and the bribery issues you've raised, absolutely critical, because certain basic requirements contained in that law are clearly visible, and the hygiene inspectors or environmental health practitioners need to make sure that those establishments comply. And we cannot have two different economies in this respect. We cannot have two different sets of rules. One for the formal food sector, where they do comply with all the requirements and legal requirements and other voluntary food safety management systems. And then we have this other sector which thwarts all the regulations and doesn't comply with anything, because that puts those customers of that sector at incredibly high risk of getting foodborne illness or getting these kinds of food poisonings that are lethal. And so the World Health Organization has actually got a formula which states that a certain number of people in a population, there need to be a certain number of environmental health practitioners. And South Africa has half the number of environmental health practitioners that it should have. So clearly, we are under.
Professor, thank you so much for your valuable input this afternoon. Unfortunately, we're out of time, but thank you nonetheless. Professor Lucia Anelich, a food safety expert, as of course we continue our special focus on food safety in the light of the recent spate of children falling ill or even dying after consuming certain food products from certain shops.